Hi guys, welcome to Pax Europiana, the Dures Sunset Talks, this time about the global power competition, the big powers of today, 2021, and how to see this from my perspective. I will give you my very much Pax Europiana perspective, and this will be basically very much, you might say, a pro-American perspective, but I give you the direction, the opinion, my take on the world as it is in reality. And I think it's very important to understand because here, from Albania to Georgia, from Ukraine to Montenegro, and also in Russia, Turkey, in this closer area around Europe, there is a lot of misconceptions on that one. Yeah? Because obviously Russia is close, Turkey is of course a big country, and China is also very active, and so there is a bit of a confusion. There's also a confusion in Austria, to my best knowledge. I can't tell much about it, but I would like to explain how our world works in the bigger picture, because that's important. I see a lot of comments on my YouTubes and Twitters, about I'm an American puppet and the world is not like that and all these things and whatever, and we need a multipolar world and all these things. Yeah? Look, it's very important fundamentally to understand one thing, and it's, I think, very important for peace in the world. Yeah? We had various breakdowns of the global order in the last century. They were terrible. And my country was involved and is guilty forever for what happened in the First World War, very much. Yeah? It was a disaster. It was connected, of course, also with Russia and with Serbia, but it was Austria who ultimately allowed itself to be provoked in a major war. It could not win, it did lose, and it was destroying the world as we knew it. That's the story of the First World War. Again, then the revanchist thinking of Germany and Austria, and all these disasters which are well documented about the Second World War. And my big apologies of my generation, obviously, for all these things, but that's not the main topic. The main topic is the post-World War II world order. And here, this is very important to understand the dimension of the disaster of the Second World War, the destruction, the major human costs, and the analysis in America, and that something big must be changed. And that means basically a new world order must be created, which is stably anchored in American power. And we live to this day in that world order, and luckily so. And obviously, straight after the end of the Second World War, this concept, the so-called, you call it Washington Consensus, San Francisco, United Nations, there's many words, so the Pax Americana, immediately it was challenged, obviously, by Stalin, who didn't want to have this kind of peace order on the European continent nor anywhere else. And he challenged it in Asia, with the takeover of China, with the threat to Japan, with the war in Korea. I mean, how much more can you challenge this world order than a direct assault led by North Korea against South Korea, of course, breaking all the post-war agreements? How much more can you challenge it than taking over power in the biggest country in China? And you must have, that was a big victory for Stalin. And obviously he challenged it in Western Europe immediately as well, with all the efforts of taking power in Italy, in France, with his proxy parties, and obviously changing Germany to a neutral country. And it was then this Western effort, this American-led effort. I'm always repeating, the NATO development and the rearmament of Germany, it was called, the integration in NATO, it's called today, 955, which then led the world on a trajectory, which is the victory later was a result. Only it took 40 years to win the Cold War. But the economic fallibility and also the loss of trust and capacity in their own Soviet communist system. They fell basically by trying to compete, they fell apart. And the people obviously ran away from the beginning. And that was leading themselves to be walled in. And that is also important to understand. The wall was in Berlin was the major symbol of their own economic disaster, and obviously then they lost also by time the narrative struggle because we were getting much more successful. So that's in a nutshell the situation. But this Western order, on what is it built? Obviously on values, on clear moral principles, on rights of man and on human rights and all these things, absolutely. But first of all, it needs power, it needs military might to be secure. There must be one strong military power to really back it up in case of challenge, because it was very much challenged. Yeah? From Vietnam, Korea first, Vietnam, but in many of the proxy wars, especially in our weak, fragile decade in the 70s and so on, Afghanistan, it's all well documented. Yeah? So it was very much challenged by the Soviet Union and other powers, obviously also minor actors, brutal actors, terrorists, they also tried to challenge this power. But what's the nature of the power? The nature of American power and the nature to have one anchor power, one anchor state, one nation, which is strong enough to sustain that order. And this is so important to understand. And there is two important, maybe three. It's less the number of population, because there are bigger nations. Yeah? The first one is obviously a moral power. And that's very important, this kind of city on the hill, and the values America is built on, and the victory in the Civil War of the Republicans and the Union, and then obviously the whole concept America is built on, to be a free republic of free people, and the whole attached value system. The second one is obviously the economic power. It's very important to understand, and this is really also true today. Even when China is catching up in nominal terms, yeah, it's all fine. You know, that's also good that they get richer. Everybody should be rich. But the immensity of the dimension of American economic and fiscal power is still unprecedented and unmatched by anybody. It's very important because here in this region the idea is that Russia is strong, you know, and it's also very big, you know, and it's also a lot of land, you know. It's not the land that matters, it's the GDP. And here is 1.5, the benchmark of Russia in trillions, and it's 2022 now. You know, they add even much more now in the recovery with Biden. The yearly growth rate of alone the next 4 years will be better, will be more output than the whole of Russia in every year. I mean, the dimensions are huge. The differential is amazing. So that's the first thing, it's the economic power, but it's also the technology. It's also the innovation factor, which a big market with such potential gives. Yeah? And all, of course, you know, this effort to talk America down is then from our enemies, you know, the end of the American century and so on and so on. It's all utterly nonsense. Yeah? And obviously there is a crisis in any political system from time to time, with Trump being so much promoted by Russia, has of course dented American self-confidence to some extent, yeah. But it's nevertheless extremely strong, and it's the anchor state, yeah. The fundamentals matters most. Yeah? It's now actually also growing in the population to be one of the biggest countries in the world. It was almost non-populated 200 years ago. It has now 330 million and growing, adding millions every year. This is amazing. But let me also talk about military power, because there is a misconception that nuclear power is something bad. Eh? Nuclear arms have kept the global peace since 1945. It's the one reason why there was no kind of big power, full-scale war confrontation like we faced the First World War and the Second World War, and we had many wild big power wars between England and Russia in Crimea, between France and Germany. The big powers of the 19th century have battled almost permanently. There was no century of peace. Yeah? There was constant war between the big powers, and big scale war between various combination of big powers. It didn't happen then after the nuclear age started, because nuclear power have kept the balance and have kept the stability of world peace and will continue to do so. And it's also not changing so much. It's maybe a bit adopting with technology, but it's very expensive to have it. Yeah? And the few countries that have it, and they have also to have the fiscal capacity to really maintain it. Yeah? Maybe there will be China having more, but it will not change the ultimate rationale that the capacity to destroy the world is absolutely there, so it's very irrational to do it. And so the stability will be there and prosperity will develop, and the American nuclear arms really work. They are deployable, and they are the threat to anybody who might think I can change the world by order by deploying some missiles. And even the Russians, which nominally have a lot of warheads as well, yeah? But in reality, what is of course the deployability, the speed, the accuracy, and all these efforts of the American nuclear power is so huge, it's so amazingly destructive, yeah? That it is the stability anchor for the world. Yeah? And attached, America is already investing in what is also important to project power, and in order to have nobody really tipping the world into a nuclear war by somehow a minor power could then go into some kind of escalation spiral and go wild and crazy and turn the world into a nuclear Armageddon. That is, of course, might be an option. But obviously America has all the necessary tools to project power effectively to avoid it, not only from cyber and from all the other things, but I want to focus on the so-called aircraft carriers, because I'm in Durres and I always greet the friends out there from the 6th Navy, but it's one part only, the 6th Navy, of the American Navy and of its amazing system of aircraft carriers. And when you can, for example, inherit a lot of nukes from the Soviet Union as Russia, and you have good scientists, you can renovate them and you can invest some money to sustain a fleet of nuclear powered aircraft carriers. This is the prime of modern technology to project power. America is replacing now, I read this article on the congressional budget now, they have already 4 of these Ford-class carriers. These are extremely expensive, $13 billion to make items to project power. America has already 4 and is replacing now gradually one by one its so-called Nimitz-class carriers. Hi guys from the 6th Fleet. So situation is, this is extremely expensive tools. These are extremely high technology behind it. And America has now overall 20 of them. There are some smaller aircraft carriers who have helicopters to project. And then it's also these 10 big ones, and the idea is to have 11. There are some of the Nimitz class out there. There is 4 of the big ones there. And the details, I'm not a military defense expert. It's all online. You can read it if you care more. But what I want to explain is the dimension of this economic potential and industrial technology, fiscal capacity translated in military power is unprecedented in global history to anybody else compared. Of course, maybe China could, in theory, build also a lot of aircraft carriers, maybe they will do it, but what kind of power they will project there? Do they have a global approach to dominate the world and to bring communism everywhere? That's not what the Chinese have done in the last 40 years, and they have integrated in the system. They have built a coalition with America, a silent one, since 1979, and they have got rich by transporting goods, making goods and services now as well towards the West. So destroying the West would be utterly unproductive for them, and they are more pragmatically interested in getting rich than dominating the world. Of course, they maybe also make many things wrong, and they will be very complicated to deal with their internal issues, which we don't like, and we criticize them, and with their one China policy, so there will be a lot of confrontation, but there will be no global kind of Soviet Union power struggle, Cold War with China. This is not their intention, that's not their interest to somehow withdraw from the world. and as the Soviet Union has ultimately done from the economic system. They were not participating in the global economy, but they were trying to dominate and bring some countries into, and quite a lot in the 70s, into their own economic system. But it was failing. They were not part of the global economic system in that sense, and that was also their big failure. So China and will not be the Cold War with China like in the situation with the Soviet Union won't be. And China will also not that we all learn Chinese and all this nonsense which some people think. This will all not gonna happen. It will be the Chinese learning English. Yeah? It's already happening. Yeah? They are part of the world system where again the anchor power is the United States of America and will stay so for the foreseeable future. Hard to say for hundreds of years, but in that dimension. And I'm very serious, because nuclear power is here to stay, and the American fiscal and industrial and technology capacity is here to stay. And this is all factors which are continuing. Yeah? And they will continue for many years, no matter what orange clown or not. Yeah? The idea, the wishful thinking of our enemies, yeah? Mostly in Russia, but also in other world capitals. There might be somebody jealous, like some in Europe have this anti-Americanism, which is like the smaller brother being overtaken, or the older brother being overtaken by the younger brother, and somehow be full of envy and spite because of that. And we have somehow, of course, the Chinese would love to see a weaker America where they can do exactly what they want inside and around themselves, and somehow that would be good for them, but it won't happen. The system anchored in American power is safe and stable for the long term. And of course, when you live in, for example, Serbia, and you hear every day China is big and Russia is great, then maybe this brainwashing works and you see the world confused. Yeah? That's, of course, I'm very sad for anybody, and that's why I make these videos, because I explain it from an Austrian perspective. Not me, but also Austria not as a state, yeah? But in the Second World War, the German-speaking people challenged the world order. It was not so clearly defined American world order, and the effort was there to challenge it. It was, of course, a complete global tragedy and a disaster. And now I can just, I'm seen as a pro-American. I'm not. It's not that the world should be governed by America, like telling everybody what to do. And no. But it's a world order. Yeah, it works for everybody who wants to be. It's called the free world. Yeah, it's not the American world, but it's the free world. But it needs a protector. It doesn't need a global policeman in a sense, but it needs an ultimately threatening posture by one lead power ready to deploy so much violence ultimately that everybody else who might challenge this world order is thinking twice, 3 times, or while considering his own end thinks that's probably not a good idea. So that's of course why nuclear power is important. That's why American aircraft carriers are important. That's why it's important not to do this kind of stupid anti-Americanism being at the Americans at any kind of comment you make, yeah? Because it's totally, first of all, irrelevant, and secondly, it's very much destroying, undermining their own European system the Americans have created after World War II, because the whole system we have, yeah, from the NATO, which was basically the Americans collecting all their allies or all their occupied territories, which they didn't really know what to do else, yeah, in complete poverty and destruction as Europe was by that moment, threatened by the Soviet Union, to collect them in NATO and then gradually enlarge them by the changes of the last century and the success then obviously also Eastern Europe then to join. And the same should be then the logic for other countries who are now free from direct Soviet or indirect Soviet control or Serbian control, join and then NATO to be safe. Yeah? It's a logical thing. It's simply quite clear. And also EU and all the other things, it's ultimately a copy of the American success model, because all the people like Jean Monnet and all the people, the big statesmen, yeah, I mean of Western European reconstruction, Adenauer was basically taken by a American military intelligence officer from his house arrest home as a retired mayor of Cologne. He was taken in to run the country for America. I mean, that's exactly how it was. Of course, then the narrative has changed because all countries want to be proud about themselves, and it's good, Germany should be proud about Adenauer. But the reality was, Germany was a defeated nation where the American looked for a statesman of some standing which was not with the Nazis and who was still alive, because many others didn't survive. He was simply so old and retired and that he was somehow surviving the terror regime of the Nazis. The Americans identified him, took him, get him to power. He was then leading Western Germany, very successful into NATO and the EU. And similar things can be said about France. There is this famous effort where the Americans militarily occupied France after it was American army there. And then there was the big issue of the 6th of May, it's called, I don't remember exact the year, it was 47, I think, when there was the exclusion crisis, it's called in history. And so on, many examples like that. Italy, of course, the most striking example, where to this day, you remember all these issues about gladiator scandal and so, because the Americans obviously were preparing for armed alternative in case of a communist takeover of Italy. And the same was also in Austria. When America withdrew after this compromise deal for neutrality, and then it was in all western parts of Austria, the Americans and the British left ammunition depots, which they knew, and also some very trusted Austrian politicians knew at the time, but not many. And then it was meant, in case of armed resistance of Soviet attack, then Austria to go into armed resistance. And then it was actually quite interesting. They found it then in the 90s. Most of them were still working, and they were usable, the weapons. And some of them, the information was lost in some archives, because luckily they were never used, and the case never came because of why? And I repeat myself, obviously this immensity of the American fiscal industrial technology superiority and the nuclear arms attached to it, and obviously the aircraft carriers. And so Austria was never rolled over, and this arm caches was never needed. Italy didn't go to the Soviets. And so all these secretive preparations for armed resistance were not needed. So what it all means for today, 2021, for the Balkans and for Ukraine, because that's the area I'm most focused. First of all, I want to explain to all my friends who may be now listening, that this is like this. You cannot then be anti-American if you're a rational person. Then you are anti-European as well. And if you are for Putin anyhow, you shouldn't watch my videos. Because, when you are anyhow for autocratic kind of dictatorships or for kind of Nazi, Soviet terror, communism or fascism, then you are anyhow in the wrong channel. Because you will be too shocked and it could blow your mind. Anyhow, hopefully you will recover if you are from that terrible lines. And if you somehow think that genocidal Serbian regimes are good, then you're also not in the right channel. Obviously, I think you got the message. The situation is like this. We are not brothers and family, but we are one value community between America and Europe, led by America. We are the free world, led by America. We are the free world. Everybody can be part of the free world who wants to be part of the free world and is not under the unfortunate situation that he or she is limited in his freedom by some autocratic regime. So it's not only for the West, not for European Union, UK, whatever, the Europeans and the North Americans. No, Latin America, Africa, and free Asia, everybody can. Japan, obviously, Australia. The free world is open for all. But it's protected by one country. And because it's not possible for the Germans to project the power, even when we in the European Union, which have now more population than the United States, but we are not so united, we don't share so much resources. I've called for resources to be shared additionally, like 0.4% additionally added via the EU budget, so that we also have enough pooling at the European budgetary process that we can buy some, at least 3, 4 aircraft carriers, because why should the American taxpayers pay for all? We could also think to have some common nuclear stuff, yeah? At least the costs to be shared, yeah? That we basically Europeanize the French nuclear arsenal. It's not a lot, they have somehow 250 all this or 200, it's very dangerous stuff, or no matter. But that would be also good that we share some of the costs and also contribute more to our own defense. I'm fully for that, but only on a European level. Because more individual national efforts in confused armies in the middle. We built a lot of tanks in the middle of Germany and stationed there under very lackluster command, which is not interested to deploy it. So it makes only sense, because always think, we in Europe, we have done all these terrible things in the past. We have not a great military experience recently. Beyond maybe the British, and they are now not in the EU, and some expect the French. Obviously, they have some capabilities, but it's minuscule compared to the American. We can just assist and somehow be the political fig leaf and go somewhere in missions in order to show that it's not only America alone, to share some of the burdens of the accusation that the world police is America alone. But we can send some guys, do some technical stuff, yeah. But the moment when the real fighting is coming, the Europeans are not well organized technically. They have not the technical capacities. They don't have the intelligence sharing capacities, and they are not used to work together. They don't know the languages. They don't not coordinated enough. So the idea is only, after peace was made, to help to sustain it. And even then, we had many problems with accidents and so on. So this will take a long time. What we really could do, because we are also now relatively rich in the European Union, with almost close to 20 trillion GDP, catching up with America, relative of course much poorer, but in the overall sum, because we are 100 million people more, or 120 million people more in the European Union, obviously we are close to America now in the GDP. And so we could also add more to our defense. But again, not Germany alone going up and adding 40 billion, completely ridiculous. So it's much better Germany builds the infrastructure in Eastern Europe, as I've said many times. Let Germany off the hook in the 2%, because they will never fight anywhere anymore. Yeah? So ultimately it's much better they build the highways, railways and the electricity infrastructure towards the border with Russia, because they're the real enemies, and American troops must be deployed very fast. And if we don't have the infrastructure ready, and we have all these complicated processes, and we cannot even bring them to a potential front line, then of course the American strategists say very clearly, oh, it's so complicated to deploy to the Russian-Ukrainian border, so why bother? Russia will be much faster there, we can do very little, and so Ukraine cannot join in NATO for that reason. Yeah? And so at least building the infrastructure through Germany, Poland would be really very good, and it's also economically very beneficial, and that can anyhow done by the European Union, and partly we are going anyhow, but we are going so slow, and that's of course very annoying for me. Now let's come to some of the political aspects of all this. Yeah? When you are a small political entity in the Balkans or in Eastern Europe, I think it's all Southeastern Europe from Georgia to and Azerbaijan, Turkey to here. It's a bit different in the case of Turkey, because it's a so-called medium regional power, but ultimately then you should not somehow annoy America too much. If you're a political personality in these countries and you have had your time, I'm talking about Mr. Berisha now, and similar like Mr. Senada, I think his time has come, and he overstayed the patience of the Americans. And so it's not very wise when you are from a very fragile, very small country in the periphery of the European free world, and then with a very difficult history, very much depending on America, then it's not so good to overstay your time. So the music is starting, the sunset is good. I hope you can still hear me. I will maybe speak more in the microphone and also counter the music. Yeah? So what I want to say is as well, yeah, when you are from Ukraine and you're very much depending on American security guarantees, yeah, it would be really good to listen more to the efforts of the reform of America. Because annoying Americans in that aspect with high level of corruption and high level of resistance to normal standard reforms is really not very reasonable. Yes, and of course it's attractive. You can think that you are in power, you were voted, you have your time in power, and you can say, the American ambassador tells me this, the European this, the British this, the Russian this, and the Chinese this, and the Indian this, and it's all very important for me, and I evaluate somewhere in a kind of so-called balancing act. Yeah. That's very popular here, learning from Tito and doing the so-called balancing between the big power and to think you are the smart ass and you can play everybody off and get rich in the process and somehow spend your time at the sun until the sun sets for you and get rich in the process and exploit the big power competition. Now, how smart that is, yeah? And how well that worked, yeah? And where ended Yugoslavia ultimately in this whole mess, yeah? And how really well this will work for Ukrainian presidents and Serbian presidents and Georgian presidents, that is really remains to be seen. Of course, you know, Russia is close and Russia has a lot of interests here and they are hard, easy to deploy hard, easy to, and you know, they know, of course, the region often much better. And then America seems far in distance. But it's there. The Sixth Fleet is there. And it's also very present and they know very well what you're doing. And then when you think some years later, are they forgotten? No, they have their archives. You know, they don't depend on YouTube videos. They know exactly what happened, when happened, and who did what. Yeah, and if you overextend your stay and you overplay your hand, from time to time, obviously, America has many interests, and they don't look too close when it's not so important, and when at least there's stability. Anyhow, we don't want to offer anything. But when America thinks now the time is ripe to make some progress in some country, and then you mess it up, and you are in the way, that I really don't recommend anybody. I can just say, I know from my student times and later in SME, I know Mr. Senada very well. He's a very nice guy, was smiling at all conferences, was high-fiving and was really sympathetic. Yeah? But he overstayed his day and yes, he is now is free again and is somehow cruising in the Adriatic. He's okay-ish somehow, but it's not a smart strategy, this kind of balancing. Yeah? And to overdo it in this kind of in the government suitcases and to think nobody watches is somehow a big mistake. Yeah? And you might think that America is fading in the sunset and that I was not very convincing with telling you the economic figures, the history, the world order, how it's anchored, the reality of the world. Yeah? You think I'm exaggerating and Trump has shown America is divided, it's declining, and you know the Chinese are coming. I mean, how delusionary anybody must be to believe that in real terms. Yeah, and I've told the facts about the military might, the technology might. Yeah, I'm involved in this debate now very actively since 30 years more or less. Yeah. And the whole idea is that, you know, the Europeans always, in the telecom sector, we are the number one. And that was the argument in the 90s. Yeah? Or we are very strong in banking. The innovation center, Europe. Of course, you know, BioNTech was now a European innovation. So we are also capable. We are not, you know, we are part of the free world. We have good guys who do inventions and who do innovations. We are also decent, yeah? We are also rich and successful, but we are rich, successful, innovative. Of course, you know, we have smart guys, yeah? But we have this because the world order is anchored here in the Western Hemisphere. Over there, there's a big nation which has nuclear weapons, which has aircraft carriers, and which secures that the system of world trade, world values, and the free world is working. And this is exactly what is the reason that other countries then can also extend themselves economically upwards, not grab other territories. Yeah? This is the reasons why also there is this enormous output revolution in the world, which is unprecedented in global history. Even these magic years of the second part of the 19th century, after the 48 revolution from 50 to 70, and then again this amazing multiplication of the global economy in these 70 years, or unfortunately only 65 years, until the world exploded in the First World War, to our great Austrian shame. But let's share the blame with the Russians and the Serbs, because they wanted this big disaster to happen. So the situation is, we have now, since the victory in the Cold War, we have come from 22 trillion GDP to 86. Yes, and there is Corona. Yes, and there was the great financial crisis. But yes, it's almost 4 times bigger GDP in just 30 years of peace and the end of the Soviet Union. I mean, this is unprecedented. This is the best 30 years ever in global history, despite all the terrors and the 9/11 and the Iraq War and the emerging Cold War and revanchist Russia and all the climate change and crises plenty we have, and the Syrian war, which is probably the biggest single disaster which happened in the last 20 years, to our big shame, because Obama didn't enter, because he was the weakest president, and now we had this very timid American President Obama and this populist in America. And I understand some people say, look, Günther, you are a delusionary, you live in the time of the Bushes and somehow, and the America is down. It always depends, obviously. The American president is a very powerful personality. And when he really doesn't want to intervene anywhere, not to save lives, and just to do the minimal thing like Obama for 8 years, then obviously other actors, they commit genocide like Assad, and they conquer other parts of countries like Putin, or they get very somehow dominant like China. That's of course the problem. And then you have such a terrible president like Trump, who intervened so hard Putin intervened so hard, and then he won. It would have been the world much better with Hillary Clinton, there's no doubt. And I say there's a lifelong supporter of the Republican Party, but that's an absolute fact. Yeah? And so we are in this mess, of course, and the world is a little bit insecure, and I have to make these videos for that reason, to explain some fundamentals again here in the sunset in Durres. And because normally that shouldn't be completely unnecessary, because it was in my youth anyhow very clear who runs the world, and that's the American world, and that's good. So was, at least for my line of thinking, obviously that was also people who loved Soviet Union in Austria. There was a lot of sad, confused people, but ultimately that was much clearer at that time, whenever the differences were not so clear. Now America is 15 times richer than Russia, and still, and the free world all over. When you just deduct the communist and autocratic countries, which ultimately are not so many. There are some broken countries like Syria, North Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua. You have some 5, 6, 7 countries, Russian proxies and Chinese proxies in Africa, and the rest of the country are more or less belonging to the free world. In terms of GDP, it's certainly 60 of 84 is with the free world. Yeah? And in fact, also China has chosen, at least economically, to be part of the free world. Yeah? They have a completely different strategy than the Soviet Union. But I don't want to repeat myself. Here is the sunset. But the sun is not setting for the American century, but the so-called Pax Europiana, which I promote, yeah, that basically the peacemaking effort of the Americans in Europe, and they have created this Pax Europiana ultimately, that this is now extended for the whole world via the OECD and the OSCE, via a reformed UN, and that we all get very successfully, very rich and very happy together in a much more peaceful and much more prosperous another 30 years. And that's what I call the second phase of globalization, which has to start now. And this is what I hope we can achieve. Yeah? And I'm actually absolutely sure it will be like this. The next 30 years will be very good. But obviously, that needs some minor adjustments of the more openness of our global institutions in terms of membership. That's the whole context of my podcast and my statements. And I have made, if you look back, I've made now over 120 different videos about all the institutions which needs to be opened, from the OECD, from the OSCE, from the UN, and so on, how to need to be reformed. But also it needs, of course, in Europe especially, where we have this key front line with Russia, we need, of course, enlarge NATO and make sure that these countries are similar like Western Germany joining NATO. That means from Ukraine to all others, and also then to have changes in Serbia or if they're ready then to join NATO as well one day. And all other countries are already there, and Kosovo and Bosnia, obviously, you know that already. There's no surprise to be fast in NATO, Georgia and Moldova as well. And so to contain this Russian revanchism and to wait Putin out, and then in the next post-Putin period, may it be a decade or two, and then we will be ready, and then also a democratic and free Russia can be integrated in the free world order. It doesn't have to be called Western, but that's the origin of it, obviously. But it's there for everybody. And it will be again as well in that period of time, even in 20 years, even in 40 years, even in another 100 years. It will be protected by hard power, nuclear and naval and also military capacities of the United States of America, ready to defend freedom globally, able to project power fiscally on the top of the world technology-wise, and unprecedented ability for global power projection. So if anybody threatens this global order, that he knows it will be lethal. And that must be always very clear. You are normally nobody can do that anyhow, so you don't worry, no missile will attack you when you tweet something against America. But if you are in a position to challenge such a world order, our free world order, then America must be able to conclusively win such a potential confrontation. That's also a clear message to China not to even try. And anyhow, Russia doesn't have the capacities to really realistically do that. They can just annoy, and they annoy a lot. If that's very smart is another question, but that's now the choice of Putin after 2012 to go all in, and he will have to live with the consequences. But again, on a more somber note, or more kind of regional note, if you are a small power, a small state, fragile state, like here in the region, or if you are even a bigger state like Ukraine, and you think you can balance your way out of this, and you don't have to listen to the American ambassador, or you go to Washington yourself, you buy your influence via some influence peddlers or public affairs, and you somehow call the president, or you have, your way in Washington, and you can somehow sideline all the embassies and the State Department because you have talked to some senators, then you are completely wrong. And the world history is full of people who were going in, Washington out, and thought they have a lot of friends there. But when the decision was taken that something has to happen, this is how big powers act. And they implement also their things which they think, and they have the power to do that. They then direct a certain policy in your country, from Albania to Ukraine, and you stand in the way of such policy at your own risk. And then you can, of course, say, I had so much with Senator in the past, he was such a great guy, and the House of Representatives, I knew so many, and, I have all these friends, and I called the ex-president. The world is not like that. Once there is a decision taken, and the power is clear, and it is, for example, now very clear. There's maybe a small majority, you can make a lot of fuss, but once it's taken, and this is my call here, you know, and because some of my friends don't understand me, and they were criticizing me, oh, don't mess up, because now when the Nord Stream 2 decision was taken by America with Germany, they had the reasons to do that, and then in Ukraine they were somehow riling up the masses against America. I mean, you really wonder. Against the only country in the world which is able to project power to defend Ukraine if it chooses to do so. And you can, of course, rile up all this kind of Stalinesque inherited anti-Americanism and talk about treason, but then you're serving only Putin. And the same is in Albania. When you then do a lot of kind of anti-Americanism, doesn't mean of your center left or center right, that the terms really don't matter then. You know, they matter, of course, in American politics, they matter in European politics, they matter in Albanian politics, in Ukraine, yeah, they matter, you know, and then you have friendships, and then you have, but when it then comes to really big state positions, yeah, the ones about Albania are not so important, but once they are made, they are made, yeah, and then you better get out of the way. And I don't say that everybody should salute, but you know, you really then, when you have done something wrong in the past, then it's maybe really good to retire. Or in the case of Zelensky, when you have a very open conflict, two open wounds, where Russia has taken two parts of your body and is not having any intention to ever give it back, like Donbass and Crimea, and then you need American power every single day. And you know what all happened in the last years with you know, then when then America decides something, yeah, and then you make a lot of mess, spend more billions on lobbying, or millions on more lobbying, not billions, but make a mess out of your own country and are confused and angry because you know, naturally every president thinks he is the most important for his people and for the world, because the world is about him. And in Ukraine, obviously, after all these things which happened since 2014 and before as well, them thinking that Ukraine is the most important country in the world is very common in Kiev. And Zelensky is a typical example of that. He thinks the world is very much turning around him. I was in this kind of impeachment hearing, America is about Ukraine and everything was, oh, and somebody called me, it was important, I must be important as well. It's not like this, yeah. The world is not about Albania and Ukraine, not about Kosovo. It's all very important for me. You know, it's also very important for Putin, yeah. It's also for Biden important, yeah. But it's not so important that any kind of decision maker in these countries can think that once the only big power in the world, which ultimately there is only one big power, able and interested and with the capacities to project power militarily, fiscally, and in all other means, and also politically, to intervene in such a country and to help her, and then you think you corner some part of the political market for a moment and you think you are invincible, and then you are really wrong, and that's really a big mistake, yeah? And then, you know, yeah, some end up in prison for some time, some go to retirement, some fade into history, and you know, they will certainly not have the support anymore. And it's very bizarre for me to have such thinking. Yeah? But I may be wrong on some things, you know, because I'm also for Austrian neutrality, because I also don't understand Kurds, and I don't understand a lot of people. Yeah? That's also, maybe I'm wrong. And when I discuss with some Austrian friends of mine, they see the world totally differently. They see America in decline, the sun is setting in America, yeah, they're a great expert on that one, and the rise of China, and you know, that's a very, you know, that's this kind of geostrategic, self-made thinking many people have, yeah. I'm also not a political scientist. You can accuse me, I also don't know my things, yeah. But I try to be an economist, and I try to be a realist, and I read and I learn, and I see the world how it is, yeah. And you know, to be against American power once it's decided in a fragile periphery country, also Austria included, we are now in EU and we are happy, we somehow lucky, but it's completely ridiculous position when you see the real size. Yeah? Because we have almost 200 countries in the world, of course not all are in the UN, like unfortunately Kosovo not, but you know, when you see that, when you think every country is the same, like every person has the same more kind of value towards the law, yes, you know, people should this be the same, and they are. We believe in human rights and we are protect them. But it's not that every country is the same, obviously. In the UN, yes, everybody has a right to vote and everybody can go, even Syrian Assad or Gaddafi could go and all these terror regimes. But the world is not exactly that, of course, the Americans will not send a tank to Vienna to tell Kurz what to do. It's not like that. He can go on and do what he wants. Who cares? But it's not very smart, because when you need something, then maybe nobody calls you. I was once, during 2003, I was several times in America, but once very interestingly, after this Austrian decision not to allow American airlines to go over airport transport for the Iraq war. And the Americans were taking note, and I said I'm from Austria, and the congressman, I was on this reception. I was not the important man, I was just the assistant of my MEP. But he told me, and one thing, be sure about it. This one, we will not forget you. Yes. And I was actually then received shortly even by a senator. That was, I remember, my Chamber of Commerce president was not received by anybody. Anyhow, doesn't matter. All is good now. Kurz is relatively pro-American, to his credit. I have to say that he has really now allowed NATO to open a mission in Vienna and all these things. It's not so bad. And you cannot change everything, because a lot of Austrians are brainwashed by this kind of socialist anti-Americanism, and of course the leftovers from our fascist past, and all this thinking is always, and this whole spite and envy driven anti-Americanism. Remember how terrible it was when Bush visited Austria and so many people protested against him, because we somehow have this fantasies of the world and these wrong conceptions. I never could change the. I did some publications, but I could never really have impact on the Austrian anti-Americanism, because it's very deeply entrenched from the history for many reasons. Anyhow, that's my little talk here in the sunset. I will now leave beautiful Durres, so no more sunset talks. I will then continue to do some sightseeing a bit, I plan, and keep with other interesting things ahead. But then I will go back to Vienna, and then it will be Schönbrunn talks again. And thank you for your attention. Thanks you for listening here from Durres. It's a wonderful place. And let me conclude with a thank you for the guys from the 6th Fleet out there. Somewhere is an American aircraft carrier to make sure the Mediterranean is safe and the bad guys are subdued. And I want to seriously and honestly thank all American servicemen and women at the American Navy positions somewhere in the world, and also in the nuclear bunker somewhere in the world, and all the scientists, and all the American taxpayers who are funding this enormous expense to be a stable rock of the global free Western world order. Let's call it the free world order, anchored by this anchor power America very strongly, firmly, since the victory in the World War II, which was, I have not talked so much about that one, also possible because American fiscal support and manpower. Let's never forget the myth that the Soviet Union was able to defeat alone is, of course, that's another topic, but it's very well documented that the massive fiscal industrial technology support of America for the Soviet Union was also decisive in this confrontation in the last fall of a world order during World War II. And let's hope that nowhere in the future we will experience a similar dramatic shock. And then always thanking every day the American anchor power to keep this world order free and strong for the coming years, and to add amazing levels of new technology, innovation power, and economic output in the decades to come. And that's what I strongly believe, and for that I want to thank everybody who makes an effort as a taxpayer, as an innovator, as a scientist, as a military or navy man, or somewhere in a silo, somewhere just very boringly watching his nuclear bomb and making sure it's working at any time when somebody threatens the free world order. And that's important. So nukes are not good by themselves, but they are very useful to protect our world order. And if anybody wants to threaten it, I would think twice. Thanks a lot for that. Best regards from Pax Europiana. More to come, but from a different location. Bye. Thanks from Dures.